welcome back. Remember last time I left you with a cliffhanger? I said that Ramses the Great was going to have a midlife crisis and was going to be changed forever. Today I want to talk about that midlife crisis and why Ramses never rode out in battle again, why his attitude seems to go from building temples to something else. I'll give you the answer in advance. I'll give you the punchline. I think Ramses undergoes a lot of hard knocks in his midlife. And you'll see, I think he's changed forever. I already mentioned one of those. His wife, his beloved, right, Nefertari, dies around year 20. That's one thing. I'm sure that affected him. But there's more. Let me first give you an indication of how he changes. In year 21 of his reign, he's about maybe 41 years old, right? He becomes king at 20, so, roughly 41 years old. He signs a peace treaty with the Hittites. Now, remember at the Battle of Kadesh, when he's young and bold, year 5, they offer him a peace treaty, and he says, no way. I'll give you a truce, temporary, but I'll be back. Now, in year 21, he signs the peace treaty. And it's unusual circumstances under which this treaty is signed. The Hittites need it. They are having to fight the Assyrians. And they don't want to fight both the Assyrians and the Egyptians at the same time. So they really need a treaty. But Ramses doesn't. He's still powerful. He's still Egypt. But he signs it. And it's an interesting treaty. Very interesting. Ramses carved it on temple walls. There's a copy of it on Abu Simbel. There's a copy of it at Karnak. And it's an interesting treaty. It has everything you'd expect in a modern peace treaty. There's non-aggression pact. I'm not going to go in your territory. You don't go in my territory. There's a mutual support pact. If I'm attacked, you support me. If you're attacked, we'll support you. There are trade agreements. It's really quite sophisticated. And I think, and this is just me speaking, I think it's the first peace treaty in history that we have, the first recorded treaty. Ramses was also impressed with the way it came, its form. It wasn't the usual document on papyrus. It was a silver tablet, and it came with seals on it. And that kind of impressed him. And when Ramses copied it on the temple wall, he said, and this was originally in silver with seals on it, so he kind of recorded that this was a neat document. Now, let me give you a feeling of the language of this ancient peace treaty. I want to read to you exactly what it says. It's my rough translation from the wall at Karnak. It says, the great ruler of Hatti, that's the Hittites, the great ruler of Hatti shall never trespass against the land of Egypt to take anything from it. Ramses the Great shall never trespass against the land of Hatti to take anything from it. If some other foe should come against the territories of Ramses and against the territories of the king, he sends word to the great ruler of Hatti saying, come with me as an ally against him. Then the great ruler of Hatti shall act with him and shall slay his foes. Right? So he's got this whole thing about what he's going to send. And so shall reciprocally Ramses for Hattusul, who is the king, and as for him who shall keep the terms of this silver tablet, Hittites or Egyptians, the thousands of gods of Hatti and the thousands of gods of Egypt will cause him to flourish. Right? So the idea is we're going to support each other, and if you stick with it, you're going to flourish. Right? Pretty impressive peace treaty. Now, Ramses signs it. He agrees to it. Why? He doesn't need it. I think he's had the fight taken out of him. It's maybe partly just his wife's death, but I think there's more to it, and you'll see. Now, there are other indications that Ramses changed. Year 34 of his reign, he marries a Hittite bride. The Hittites send the princess for Ramses to marry. Now, this marriage is not a love match. Undoubtedly, Ramses never saw her. I mean, she's 800 miles away. This is a political union. Very often, a king of Egypt would marry a foreigner, take her as a wife, to sort of cement a political union. And Ramses does this. And it's kind of neat, though. Ramses has a whole document carved on his temples about this marriage. And he's got to boast. Ramses always had to boast no matter what. And what he boasts is, this Hittite princess comes with more treasures than the daughter of the king of Babylon. So the idea is, I'm not just taking a wife. I'm getting all kinds of goodies with her. Now, what would she come with, When you married a foreigner, it was a chance for you to get exotic goods. So, for example, right, there was no lapis, that wonderful blue stone that the Egyptians liked. There was no lapis in Egypt. So she could be coming with minerals, lapis lazuli. She'd be coming maybe with horses, different strain of horses, things like that. So she's coming with quite a dowry, and Ramses makes a big deal of it, saying, you know, this is a dowry. And there's a very, very interesting comment at the end of Ramses' account of this bride arriving in Egypt. You know, she's, of course, described as beautiful, more beautiful than anything. The thing that impressed Ramses and the Egyptians more than anything, she comes with an escort, of course. She is a princess, and she's going to be a wife of Ramses the Great. So she comes with a big escort of an army, Hittite. And at the end of the document, it says, Hittites and Egyptians sat together, eating, not fighting. It was like so unheard of that they would sit together at the same dinner table and eat together. It was worthy of commenting and writing it in stone. So Ramses is certainly changing. We have another exchange of Ramses with the Hittite king, and it's a sign of friendship. The Hittite king writes to Ramses and says, my sister can't conceive a child. Could you send an Egyptian physician to help? Now, this is not a surprising request. I mean, granted, it comes from the Hittites, but the Egyptians were famous for their medical skills. In ancient Egypt, medicine was called the necessary art. It was an art, but it was necessary. You needed it. And if you'll remember, we had a Greek tourist who went to Egypt around 450 BC, Herodotus, and recorded everything. One of the things that astounded Herodotus was the medical skills of the Egyptians. And he discusses it. He says, and apparently the Egyptians are the first ever to have specialists. Before, you were just a physician. But they had specialists, and Herodotus mentions it. There are specialists of diseases of women, gynecologists. Right? There are specialists of diseases of the eye. So the Egyptians had specialists, and it's not surprising then that the king of the Hittites says, my sister can't conceive, send me a physician. So Ramses writes back, and it's a funny reply, it really is. Ramses says, you know, I know your sister, she's 50 if she's a day, no wonder she can't conceive. But he says, but I'll send a physician anyway, and he sends a physician. But I think it's a sign of friendship rather than kind of combativeness. Ramses has really changed. In year 44, Ramses marries yet another Hittite bride, right? So Ramses is mellowing. There's no question about it. Now, why is he mellowing? Well, as I mentioned twice, he lost his wife, beloved Nefertari, but he also loses his firstborn son, Amenher-Khepchef. He dies around year 17, and I'll talk a little more about why he dies later. He also loses his son, Chaim Wasset, the first archaeologist in history, the high priest of Memphis who builds this, tomb for the Apis bulls. He's had a lot of people die. And it's not surprising. Think about it. He's got 100 children. He probably has a dozen wives, maybe 50 concubines. Somebody is going to die every year. And Ramses, in midlife, doesn't go out to war again. And he turns his attention in building from temples to tombs. He's going to start to concentrate on tombs. Now, one of the tombs that he builds is probably the most beautiful in all of Egypt. I think almost everybody who sees it agrees. The tomb of Nefertari, his wife, is the most beautiful in all of Egypt. It's in the Valley of the Queens, not far from the Valley of the Kings. I'm not sure why it's so beautiful. I've seen it a few times. I think it's more beautiful than any other tomb because of the background. It's painted white, a stark white, and all the figures of Nefertari and the gods are against this white background. So I think that's part of it. The tomb had quite a few problems. It was terribly damaged when discovered in 1908, I think it is, by Schiaparelli, an Italian excavator. The plaster was on the floor. Much of it was on the floor. And the reason is that salt in the stone, in the back of the plaster, was migrating to the surface in crystal form and pushing the plaster off. There was a tremendous conservation effort in the 1980s to save the tomb. The Getty Museum, the famous Getty Museum in California, also has a conservation institute. And gratis, they have more money than they need, and they do good things. Free of charge, they restore ancient monuments. And they sent a team of Italians to work on the tomb of Nefertari to restore it. And basically what they did was they removed the plaster. You put a tissue facing on the plaster, remove it from the wall, scrape each salt crystal away, put a sealant on the wall, replace the plaster, and then the tomb is fixed. They had an interesting decision to make. What about where the plaster's missing? Should you fill it in? They could have filled it in so you'd never know, and you'd see a virtually intact tomb as it was built. They decided to fill in some places in the tomb, but not so that you couldn't tell that it was restored. So when they restored it, they put a very fine cross-hatching, so you can always tell what's restored and what's not, but you can still look at it as a kind of intact unit. So Nefertari's tomb, one of the most beautiful in all of Egypt, is built by Ramses the Great for his beloved. But that's far from the only tomb he built. The most famous, perhaps, is called KV5. KV5, that's Kings Valley 5. Every tomb in the Valley of the Kings is numbered. And this one was rediscovered about 10, 15 years ago by Professor Kent Weeks. It was on the cover of Time magazine. And the reason it was on the cover of Time magazine, it is the largest tomb in all of Egypt. And that says quite a bit. Ramses apparently built it for his sons. Now, he's got 52 sons, so you can imagine what kind of tomb they are going to need. And it is a very strange tomb. I've only been in it once. It's dangerous to go in. It was discovered actually around 1837, but then it was lost again. Now, you might wonder, how can you lose a tomb, right? A tomb that's open? The answer is that occasionally in the Valley of the Kings, where the humidity is super low, 19, 20, there are thunderstorms once every 10, 15 years. Real thunderstorms. It's rare, but it's violent when it happens. And the water comes rushing down the Valley of the Kings. From the mountaintops, comes right down through the Valley of the Kings, almost like a big sewer. And when the water comes down, it carries rocks and boulders with it, all kinds of debris, fast moving. And they pour into the tombs. And the debris goes into the tombs. And what eventually happens is tombs get blocked up with this debris over the centuries. And then sand goes against it, and you just lose it. So this was a tomb that was lost. And then it was found by Professor Kent Weeks when he was doing his survey of the Valley of the Kings. He was making a very scientific map of every single tomb in the valley, and he had to rediscover it, and he found it. Now, when they found the tomb, it was packed with debris. And they had to climb in. There were two people who went in first, Kent Weeks and his assistant, Catherine Rehrig, who was a specialist on the Valley of the Kings. They had to climb in on their bellies. There was only about 3 feet from the top of the debris to the ceiling. So they're climbing in and looking and trying to see what's going on here. And it was pretty much packed with debris. But they could see they were in a large pillared hall with many pillars. Now, this tomb they would excavate for the next 10, 15 years. And it eventually became clear this was the largest tomb in all of Egypt. Very strange, not like any other tomb. You go into it, there are many side chambers. When I say many, 20, 30. Then you get to the back of the tomb, and there's another level. You go down, and then it comes back on itself. And you have more chambers, another 50, 60. And then there's a third level, which hasn't been excavated yet. This is a tomb which will take perhaps 100 years to excavate. You can't just pull out all the debris. It changes the atmospheric condition within the tomb, and then the walls start to shift. So you've got to remove some debris, close the tomb, let it stabilize, then next season come back. It'll take a long time to excavate this tomb. But this is probably for the sons of Ramses the Great. So Ramses builds a tomb for his sons. He also builds his own tomb. Now, Ramses' tomb is one of the great ones in the Valley of the Kings. It's really quite spectacular. It's badly damaged by these floods, but it's quite spectacular. To give you an idea of the magnitude of building tombs in the Valley of the Kings, let me say this. Ramses employed an entire village of workmen. We have their village to do nothing but work on his tombs. It's called Deir el-Medina, the workmen's village. And we know more about this city than any other ancient city in the world, because the workmen used to write notes to themselves, right, to each other. And they didn't use papyrus. That's expensive. What Egyptians used as scrap paper was broken pots. You know, you broke a pot, it's a bit of scrap pad. So you could write a note in ink, and then you leave it for a friend or send it off. And these pot shards are almost indestructible. So eventually the town dump for Deir el-Medina became piled high with thousands of pot shards with writing on it called a straka. And they were translated, and it gives us a picture of life in the village of Deir el-Medina. And we know a lot about these guys and how they built the tomb of Ramses the Great. There was a right-hand gang and a left-hand gang. Two teams working simultaneously, literally back-to-back in the tomb. One would work on the right-hand wall, the other would work on the left-hand wall. They had different skills. There were guys whose specialty was carving, just chipping out the rock. Other guys would plaster the wall. Other guys would put the grid down. Some were painters, some were sculptors. We even know that when they were given their tools at the beginning of the week, and they had a 10-day week, the Egyptian calendar had a 10-day week, they were given their bronze chisels at the beginning of the week. At the end of the week, they turned them in, and they were weighed to make sure that they weren't stealing any of the metal. Metal was valuable. Bronze was really valuable. So they would weigh the chisels before and after the work week. You know, the same thing happened in the United States around turn of the century, say 1900, when we had gold coins in circulation. People used to make a living by taking the gold coin and just shaving a little bit off the edge. And you get a few thousand coins, you shave a little off, and you have a nice little pile of gold. That's why the government started putting the milled edges around coins so they couldn't be shaved. And this was started by Ramses' workers, obviously, who were shaving their bronze tools and making some extra money on the side. So they build Ramses' tomb. Now, I believe that the burial chamber of Ramses the Great held more treasure than any other room in the ancient world. I think it had to. Think about what Tutankhamun's tomb held. Fabulous treasures. Fabulous treasures. And he was a minor king who only ruled for 10 years, died suddenly, and they had to just get the stuff together fairly quickly. Ramses had 67 years to prepare for his death. It was an incredible treasure that must have been in there, but it was all looted, all gone, right? Now, I think that Ramses turning his attention to tombs, not riding out to do battle anymore, I think it's a psychological event, so to speak, his midlife crisis. I think he's had these hard knocks. He has lost his wife, his beloved wife. He has lost two of his important sons, and many more undoubtedly. But I think there is another event that just may have really done him in. And that's what I want to discuss now. The event, the biblical Exodus. It may be that Ramses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and this may have been the last knock that Ramses suffered. Now, let me say something about the Exodus story in the Bible. First, it is the event in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, that is mentioned more than any other event. No event in the Old Testament is mentioned more frequently. It is perhaps the most important event to the Hebrews. Why? Because it establishes their legitimacy. It talks about going to the promised land, all of that. Very important. So it's a very important event, mentioned in the Bible quite often. And the big mystery is, how come there is no archaeological evidence for it? There is absolutely no external evidence for the Exodus, that it ever happened. Why not? Well, let's say something about what the story is. You'll remember some of it, I'm sure. According to the biblical account, we have the Israelites in Egypt, and they are in bondage, right? They're in bondage. Now, we don't have the name of the Pharaoh. This is an interesting thing. He's only called Pharaoh. We don't say Ramses. They don't say Thutmose. He's always called Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is not originally an Egyptian word. It is not the way that the Egyptians called the king. The Egyptian word would be Nesut, one word for king. There are others, not Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a corruption of two Egyptian words, Per, which means house, and Ah, which means great. Pera, the great house. And it seems as if the foreigners, the Hebrews, the Israelites, called the king the guy who lived in the great house, the Pera, the Pharaoh. So we get it from that. So he's not named. Now, why not name him? In such an important account, why not name the king? I think the answer is that the Hebrews want to make a point that this isn't personal. We're not dealing with just a man. It's the Israelites against the Pharaoh, against something bigger, almost against the God, because remember, the Pharaoh is a god. So it's just the Pharaoh. Now, according to the story, we have these Israelites in bondage. They are toiling for the Pharaoh. They are building store cities, if you'll remember. Now, store cities, this is for the army. Store cities are cities with warehouses where you keep the equipment, the sandals, the spears, the this, the that. So that makes sense. It's the time of Ramses. Anyway, they're building store cities, and we have the names of the store cities. That's our clue. The store cities are Pitum, Pitum, means something like the house of Atum, house of Tum. And one of the store cities, the other one, is named Ramses. P. Ramses, right? So one of the cities is named Ramses. Now, the problem is there are 11 kings named Ramses, but it's a good clue that it could be our Ramses. Other details in this story. If you remember, Moses is the leader of the Israelites. Now, Moses is an important name. We have no evidence of anybody named Moses ever being in Egypt, right? We have no evidence of lots of Israelites in Egypt. We have no evidence of any of this. But the name Moses, I think, is important. First, if you read a lot of Bibles, there's often a comment about the name Moses, the etymology, the origin of that name. Remember, Moses is set adrift in a basket because the Pharaoh has ordered that all the male Israelite children be killed, and his mother's afraid, takes the baby, puts it in the basket, and follows it down the river in the reeds, looking to see who finds it. And the Egyptian princess finds it and takes it out of the water. And the Bible often says, or the commentary says, she named him Moses, because in Hebrew, Moses means to draw out, to bring out. Now, this doesn't make any sense. Why is an Egyptian princess going to all of a sudden start speaking Hebrew and name a kid Hebrew? Crazy. What the truth is, and what gives a little bit of strength to the story, is that Moses is an Egyptian name. It means birth. And that makes sense. She's getting a kid. So she calls him birth or born. So Moses is a good Egyptian name. Forget this Hebrew stuff. Now, according to the story, they are toiling for the Pharaoh. And if you remember the story about the straw and the bricks, they go to Pharaoh and they say, and they have all kinds of nerve. They say, we want to celebrate our own holiday. You know, can we have a couple of days off? And the Pharaoh says, are you nuts? He says, you're not getting a day off. You know, you're going to have to make bricks without straw. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to have to make bricks in a new way without the straw. You use straw in bricks, by the way, as a binder to make it stronger. What it means is they've got a quota. They're going to have to make the same number of bricks, but nobody's going to supply them with the chopped straw. They're going to have to chop their own straw and make just as many bricks as before. So it's extra work, right? Now, how are they going to get out of this bind? This tough Pharaoh won't let them go. The answer is God. If you'll remember, God speaks to Moses in the form of a burning bush. And he says, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. Moses is unsure of this. He just says, how's this going to happen? I'm not, I can't do this. And Pharaoh says, I've got some tricks for you. Don't worry. Actually, God says to him, I've got some tricks for you. He says, take your staff and throw it on the ground. and it becomes a serpent. And then it turns back into a staff. He says, do that in front of Pharaoh. So Moses is going to give him divine powers. And he says, okay, I'll try. So he goes with Aaron, his brother, to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. Throws down his staff, right? Does the old boom. And what happens? It turns into a serpent, picks it up. Pharaoh is unimpressed. Doesn't do a thing for him. He calls in his magicians. Pharaoh's magicians come in, and they do the same thing. They throw down a staff. Apparently, it's the old snake trick. I mean, everybody knew it, you know? And only is Pharaoh, sort of impressed when finally Moses throws down the staff, and then it devours the magician's serpents, right? So that's a little better. But now, eventually, the 10 plagues happens. You get these locusts and boils, and the river turns to blood. And nothing convinces the Pharaoh to let the people go. Nothing. Until the last plague. Now, if you remember the last plague, the firstborn are killed. And Moses is told to put lamb's blood on the doortop of all the Hebrews. So the angel of death will pass over their houses and not kill any of their firstborn. This is why we have Passover. It celebrates the passing over of the angel of death. And it happens. The firstborn are killed. And if you'll remember, Pharaoh's firstborn son is killed. Pharaoh's firstborn son is killed. And that's when Pharaoh allows the Israelites to leave. Only after the firstborn is killed. Now, is there any truth to this story? I mean, is there anything that makes you think it really happened? We don't have archaeological evidence. Is there internal evidence? The answer is, I think that something happened. I believe there is something historical related to the Exodus story. It's not as in the Bible, though. For example, the Bible says 600,000 men, not including the women and children, left Egypt. That's far too large. The whole population of Egypt was maybe 1 million. So you can't have 600,000 Hebrew men leaving. I think it may have been something happened, and it got larger in the telling. Maybe it was only 600. Maybe even 60. But I think something happened. And let me explain why. There are certain internal references that make it ring true. In the very beginning of the story, the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, are told by Pharaoh, watch the stones. Watch the stones. Now, what does that mean, watch the stones? They are being instructed to kill every male child. Stones means a birthing stool. The Egyptians gave birth sitting down. Egyptian women gave birth seated on a stool, which was often 2 stones. It's a very reasonable way to give birth, by the way. Gravity assists you. Rather than lying down and pushing, gravity will help you pull the baby out. So this reference to watch the stones is pretty good. It's pretty good. It's sort of Egyptian. Also, where are these store cities built, right? In the Delta. That's where Ramses moves the capital to. There's a lot of internal evidence here that there's something true to this story, right? One of the cities, remember, is called P. Ramses. So I think there's some element of truth to it. Now, what about the Pharaoh's firstborn? Well, remember Ramses' firstborn, Amun-Her-Kepchef, who doesn't become Pharaoh? He dies just about the time that scholars think the Exodus occurred. In other words, it is even possible that Ramses, who is probably the Pharaoh of the Exodus, loses his firstborn son during this Exodus period, year 17 of his reign. Amun-Her-Kepchef dies, we're pretty sure of that. And this may have been another shock to Ramses. He has had another defeat. Think about it. His wife dies, his son dies, other sons die. The Israelites leave Egypt. He pursues them, even if you remember, and his army is swallowed up, right? In the Sea of Reeds. It's not the Red Sea, that's a mistranslation. Ramses has had an awful lot of hard knocks, and I think it changed him forever. He never rode out to battle again. He stayed in Egypt. He dies an old man at the age of 86, crippled, terrible tooth decay, abscessed mandible that may have killed him at the age of 86. Ramses the Great wasn't always Ramses the Great. And I think it's important to view him as a person, a builder, a military man, a family man, but also somebody who is really in severe distress in the last years of his reign. But think of him as a person. I'll see you next time.